Hi class, welcome to chapter 37 lecture. This is the last lecture in unit 5 and therefore the last lecture of the semester. I'm sure you're really upset to hear that. So let's go ahead and get this started and get her done so that you can move on to exam 5. So this chapter really is all about how to define a community. And remember, let's remind ourselves that a community, if we're looking at an ecosystem, so a particular area, San Diego or the Chaparral region of Southern California and so on, the community would be all of the population. So everything that's living in that area. So everything that's interacting with one another in a particular geographic region. And of course, what this kind of what follows from this is how do those species interact with one another? Remember that inter means between. So when we're looking at interspecific interactions, we're looking at interactions between species. So how do all of these different organisms in this community, remember that includes bacteria, that includes fungi, insects, all the little creepy crawlies, the things that are too tiny for us to see with our eyes, all of the plants, and everything that we can see. So, and of course, all the things that we can't see as well. So all of the biotic factors, remember that we're talking about organisms, so we're talking about the biotic component of this geographic region of this ecosystem. Remember, biotic means living. So how do these species interact with one another? What are their relationships with one another, and so on? This branch of science that looks at these interspecific interactions is called community ecology. And they really study three major things. And so the first two are kind of obvious, I think. The first one would be what species are actually there. So if we were to go out to a canyon, hold on a second. I need to pause really quick. Okay, sorry about that. I have a really runny nose today, and I want to get this done. Okay. This is a mess. Okay, so the first two kind of are your baseline kind of pieces of data, right? What species are there? So in other words, we can do like a field study and say there's mice and bats and this kind of plant, but not that kind of plant and so on. And then how many different kinds of course, and that goes to follow that, how many different kinds. So what is the diversity of species within that geographic area? And then of course, how do all those different species interact with one another? What animal is prey for another animal? What different plants does this animal eat, and so on? This is called community dynamics. So it's really these three major features of community ecology that scientists study. Oh, come on, advance already. Let's go. There we go. Okay. So what are these four key properties? When we're defining a community and we're trying to look at a particular geographic region and we want to define that region by its community, what are the four things that we're going to look at? So we're going to talk, of course, about when we count up all the species, we're going to say how diverse that community is, how many different kinds of animals, and organisms, not just animals, how many different kinds of organisms coexist within that particular community, what is the dominant species, how do they respond to disturbances. So this could be I don't know if catastrophic events is the right word, but I can't think of a better word than disturbing events. So a fire, for example, a perfect example are areas that are prone to forest fires. Think about tidal regions, right? How the fact that water can ebb and flow is a disturbance. How does that particular region respond to the fact that sometimes you're underwater and sometimes you're not? How does a region that gets frequent hurricanes respond to the fact that we have periodic flooding and so on? And then finally, we want to define a community in terms of its trophic structure. And to me, what a trophic structure, and we'll talk about this more later at the end of the lecture, trophic structure is really all about relationships. How do animals, again, not just animals, organisms, how do all these organisms within this region interact with one another, and what are their relationships with one another? All right, so before we get started talking about each of these in detail, I want to talk about some vocabulary terms with you so that we can kind of define what what these different types of relationships between organisms are. And the first term that I'm going to describe is an ecological niche. And an ecological niche is the way that the balance of an organism's use of both anything that's living and anything that's not living in its environment. So let's take, for example, first of all, let's remind ourselves, remember that biotic means living and abiotic means not living. So it's not alive. So let's think about our barnacle example. We did a field study of barnacles in our last chapter. Let's think about what biotic and abiotic influences or outcomes barnacles have. Can you think of any? Well, barnacles have to eat something, right? And if you recall, barnacles are filter feeders, and they basically suck in a bunch of water. And when they do that, they filter out phytoplankton, which are alive, and they let the water kind of filter through. That's why they're called filter feeders. So in terms of their biotic resources, barnacles eat phytoplankton. They are prey, or I'm sorry, they're predators. They prey upon phytoplankton. They are food for otters. For example, I think otters really like barnacles. They can pry them off of the rocks and break them open and eat them. So that would be one example of the biotic influences that barnacles have in an environment. What about abiotic resources? Well, what is it doing to the water? Remember that water is not alive. Water is an inorganic substance, right? It's H2O. So how does water influence barnacles? Well, water holds the food that barnacles eat. And so barnacles need to be underwater, ideally all the time, right? Barnacles prefer to be underwater as opposed to out of water. Another one would be, what kind of gas does it need? Remember that organisms, animals, like barnacles and like us, we need oxygen and we give out carbon dioxide. On the other hand, plants or photosynthetic organisms, maybe there's some algae that's kind of attached to this rock as well, they need carbon dioxide and they give off oxygen as a waste product. So when we're talking about an ecological niche, we're talking about the resources that an organism needs to survive. So what does it eat? What eats it? What kind of space does it need? Where does it try to live? Can it move? Can it fly? Does it have to attach itself to something like the barnacle does here? And so what this does when we talk about the niche that it plays, this niche really defines where it can live. So if, for example, a barnacle can only filter feed, right, then it has to have, like I said earlier in the slide, it has to live underwater, right? And so ideally it would always live underwater, and it would only spend part of its time above water. If it if it attaches itself to, say, a boat, and now that boat gets taken out of the water for storage over the winter, that barnacle is going to die because it has no food and it has no water, right? So the needs, its abiotic and biotic needs, is going to define where that particular organism, in this case a barnacle, can live. So again, when we're talking about those trophic structures and the community, the interspecific interaction, so how we can define a community, we can kind of clump them into, I would say, for myself, I would say four categories, because I like to lump predation and herbivory into the same, but they're slightly different. And those so we're going to say five, and those five are competition, mutualism, predation, herbivory, and parasitism. And you can see that we can define these based on, so again, when we're talking about a relationship, we're talking about two different organisms. And so we have organism 1 and organism 2. And so we can define this relationship based on what its outcome is for each organism. So in the case of competition, for example, the effect on both of these organisms is negative. So there's a negative outcome in competition for both interacting parts in this case. So we're going to talk about each of these. We're going to talk about each of these in detail here in the next several slides. So let's talk about competition first. Competition is is not good. Again, it's a negative relationship. In other words, neither competitor, neither organism wins in the case of competition. So here we have actually two different kinds of barnacles. We have a how do you pronounce this? Cathylamus, I think is the way you pronounce that, and Balanus, two different species of barnacle, and they cannot exist in the same environment if they are using the same resource. They will basically compete, and that causes them to lose energy, and one of them is going to get squeezed out. One of them, in other words, is going to get excluded because they can't compete as well as that other organism for those same resources. So what happens here, for example, remember that filter feeders want to be underwater. So if we're looking at a tidal region and we have all of these, it's a great, you can literally go into the tide pools at Sunset Cliffs or at Cabrillo. I told myself, did I do this? I think I did this in the last voiceover. I meant to look that up. I'm pretty sure it's called Cabrillo. Oh wait, here, I have it right here. I have the... Yeah, Cabrillo National Monuments, the tide pools down there at the end of Point Loma, Cabrillo. That's okay. I got the pamphlet right in front of me. Okay, so you can actually go down there and see this in action. You can look at the tide pools, and based on where that tide pool is in terms of whether it's underwater at high or low tide, there will be different organisms in that tide pool based on how much solar access it gets, how often it's underwater during high and low tide, and so on. It's actually really, really cool. So let's just look at our example here. We have these two different kinds of barnacles, and the Balanus species, excuse me, the Balanus species outcompetes the Cathylamus species in terms of space. They're bigger and they can attach more firmly to the rock, and so they're going to get the better space basically, because they want to be, if you think about it, you want to be as low as possible, because that's where you're going to be covered by the most water. Remember that the lower you are, the more likely you have water on you. If you're really high up, the higher you go up on the rock, the more time basically you're going to spend not being able to eat, and how would I say, in like sunlight, right? Like basically drying out, and you don't want that. And so these smaller Cathylamus species keep getting pushed up the rock, and this is called a realized niche, and it's ecological niche. It keeps getting pushed out. If the Balanus species weren't here, these would spread out and take over that area that the Balanus species was in. But because they're getting pushed out, over time, they're adapting to their particular area. And this is called resource partitioning. I think this is the next. Yeah, this is the next. Whoops. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. It's called resource partitioning. So if you think about it over time, again, think about, we're talking about natural selection here. So we're talking about a really, really long period of time, tens of thousands of years. These smaller Cathylamus species are better. They're getting better at basically avoiding desiccation, which means avoiding drying out. They have higher tolerance for salinity and so on, because they can't compete with the Balanus species for geographic region, or not, I shouldn't even say geographic, but location on the rock. So this is competitive exclusion. One species, in this case, the Balanus species, is outcompeting the Cathylamus species and pushing them up higher on that rock. And so they're finding their own realized niche in this case. And we've seen this, we actually have studied this in a small way with those geckos. If you recall, you did that little kind of measuring experiment on the different kinds of geckos, and we could see that some geckos lived high up in the canopy if this was a tropical ecosystem, right? Some of the gecko species lived way high up in the trees. Some of them lived on the tree trunks themselves, while others lived in shrubs, and then yet others lived in the grass. And so this realized niche is called, this can lead to resource partitioning. So it basically, instead of competing with one another where they both lose, they're going to find a spot where they can compete best, if that makes sense. So for example, What would be a good example of this? Um, Trying to think of an example of this. I actually don't want, I shouldn't give an example, like a people example here, because it kind of implies that what's happening here is that these two species are competing with one another directly. And that's not what's really happening. It's the populations that are competing with one another in a way. Remember, this is happening over many, many, many generations. It's not like this gecko was speaking to this gecko in their little gecko language and said, okay, you stay down there and I'm going to stay up here. That's not what's happening here. So what's happening is that over very long periods of time, one gecko subspecies is better. Were these geckos or lizards? They might have been lizards, actually. Whatever it is, these lizards, let's just say, these lizards over very, very long periods of time. This particular species, in Enceladus, where's Enceladus? Looks like he perches on shady branches, whereas the Distichus is a sunbather. He likes to go on in sunny areas, and so these two populations over time have led to adaptations that help them in their particular niche, right? He probably is adapted to higher temperatures, whereas this one tends to be in the shade. This one's probably really good at climbing, where this one maybe not so much, and so on. So now these two species can coexist. They're really no longer competing with one another because this guy is up in the tree, in a shady tree, whereas this guy is on a sunny rock, or it looks like a fence post or something. So this is called resource partitioning. Okay, let's talk about our next relationship. And this is a good one. I like mutualism. I think this is actually, I'm not an ecologist, but I really feel that mutualism is probably much more prevalent in nature than people realize. And mutualism is when you basically have a symbiotic relationship. I'm sure you've heard the term symbiosis. It basically means that both people or both things, both members of the relationship benefit in this coexisting model. So we have a positive relationship in this case. And this is actually a fun example of a symbiotic, I shouldn't say fun, it's actually very painful if you're anything other than the tree and the ant. This is an acacia tree. I want to say that they're native to Australia. I think there's some acacia trees in San Diego. Just like kind of imported as decorative trees. But I'm pretty sure they're native to Australia. And they have this really cool relationship with these ants. They're fire ants. They're very aggressive, and the fire ants basically protect the tree. They don't let anything else on this tree. Any insect, any animal, anything that even touches this tree will get bit by these ants. They swarm them, and they're really, really protective of this tree because this tree is their home. This is where they live. The tree actually grows these really weird little. They're basically like. I don't know, they're almost like candy for the ants. It's sugar and fat. It's this little, basically very nutrient dense. It has lipids and carbohydrates in it, and the ants eat them. And it seems like this is some type of weird evolutionary relationship because these little packets that grow on the end of these leaves don't really seem to serve a purpose for the tree. But of course the ants love them. This is basically a food source for the ants. And then the tree also has these really weird, they're like thorny outgrowths, from the tree, and the ants, and they're hollow, and the ants go inside, and that's where they lay their eggs and kind of nest and burrow. So it's this really perfect relationship between an ant and this tree. The tree, they essentially, benefit one another, and this is called mutualism. So again, I kind of lump predator, prey, and herbivory in the same one organism benefits, of course, and one doesn't. So predator, prey, of course, we know is in the case of animals. You can see that we have a little frog hiding in the tree bark there. And then if we call it herbivory, we have an animal that is, or an organism, I should say. An organism is preying upon a plant, so it's eating a plant. Predator, prey, and herbivory are very interesting cases because, I shouldn't say this. Because mutualism and competition also leads to evolution. But I would say that the predator, prey, and herbivory relationship not only leads to evolution, but they lead to very specific they have very specific selective pressures to avoid predation. And this, I mean, you can't get a better example than this. You might not have even seen the frog there. Camouflage is a perfect example of this, right? This frog has over many years and many generations has evolved this really great camouflage that allows it to hide in plain sight. And this is simply to avoid predation. This particular plant will, I want to say that this caterpillar will lay eggs, and they look like this, and they won't lay eggs on a leaf that already has eggs on it, or a plant that already has eggs on it. And so, this plant has developed these little kind of faux looking eggs, and so the caterpillar won't, lay its eggs on, that particular plant. Kind of an ingenious little trick of evolution there. Okay, this is so gross. I don't even want to look at this slide for very long, so I'm going to be really quick with this one. Parasitism is also where one benefits and one is harmed, but in the difference, of course, between herbivory and predation is that these die, right? If the frog gets eaten, he's dead. If the plant gets eaten, obviously the entire plant gets eaten, it will die as well. Whereas parasitism, one is being harmed, but it's not being killed. So a perfect example, if you're a gardener, everyone knows what these are. These are aphids, the bane of any gardener's existence. They will feed off of plants, and although they only ever take enough to basically make the plant useless to a gardener, and they suck the sap or the nectar out of the plant's little vessels, and the plant will never really produce anything, and it gets taken over by these aphids. The example on the right is so gross that I was going to look it up and I didn't even want to, but this little insect thingy goes into this fish's mouth and it eats the fish's tongue and lives in the fish's mouth. It's so gross. And I just want to pretend that doesn't exist. So let's not talk about that one anymore. Okay. The last example, I think, is this in, why didn't I talk about commensalism? Oh yeah, so it's not one of them, but I just wanted to mention it because it's kind of a cool one to think about. It's very difficult to prove. I think commensalism is probably a very difficult relationship to define because it's where one organism benefits and then there's really no effect on the other organism. So a couple of examples that you could maybe point to in nature are those little fish that kind of suck on and hang on to the underside of large fish, right? So, they don't necessarily seem to harm the larger fish, but of course they have a huge advantage because they're not burning energy moving from one place to the next. Another example are epiphytes. I think this is a tillandsia. They're kind of popular in San Diego if you're into plants. They're really beautiful, and they're very kind of decorative. You see them in like really expensive floral arrangements and sometimes in landscaping. Another great example are orchids. Orchids are are orchids epiphytes? I don't think bromeliads. I'm sorry, not orchids. Orchids also are similar, but they're not epiphytes. So bromeliads and these tillandsia is a type of bromeliad, and essentially what they do is they live in the bark or these like kind of carved out areas. They find like a little kind of crevice in a really large tree, and they grow in the tree, and they're kind of cool. Just from a botany perspective, they're really cool because they don't live in soil how they get water and how they get nutrients is pretty interesting, but it doesn't seem to harm the tree at all. And of course the plant in this case has a place to stay. Another example would be like for us, for example, we have lots of bacteria that are living on our skin or in our, in different crevices of our body, and they don't really harm us. And they don't seem to play much of a role in protection. In many cases, that's kind of debatable from a bacteriology point of view, but we're giving them a home, and it's warm, and they have everything that they might need on our skin, so we're kind of giving them a home, and we don't really pay attention to them. So that would be kind of considered a commensal relationship between us and our bacteria. All right. So ask yourself, what kind of interspecific interaction, what kind of relationship between these two organisms are you seeing? If you've seen Finding Nemo, you know the answer to this. So if you haven't seen Finding Nemo, I will tell you that this is a clownfish, right? This is a little clownfish, and this is a sea anemone. Sea anemone, these little tentacles, these tentacle-looking things are called tentacles, and they're full of poison. And an anemone is actually a really efficient predator, and these tentacles again are full of poison, and they just kind of float by. They kind of float in the water, and if a fish or some other organism gets close to it, the anemone, that poison, that toxin that are in the tentacles will sting the fish, and the anemone eats it. So it turns out that clownfish are immune to this poison, this toxin. It doesn't sting them and it doesn't paralyze them like it does other fish. So the the clownfish actually makes the anemone its home, and it lives in the anemone. So this is a mutualistic relationship. So what happens here is the anemone has a place to stay, right? It has a home, and it turns out that with these sea anemones, their little tentacles can kind of, how would I say? They can kind of die off almost like a plant, like different outgrowths of a plant, like it needs pruning every once in a while. And so the clownfish can actually nibble off these dead pieces of the anemone, and it provides food. So the anemone is providing a lot of benefits to the clownfish. It gives it a place to live, it gives it protection, and it also gives it food. So what is the clownfish doing for the anemone? Well, it turns out that the clownfish is basically bait for the anemone. So one, it prunes the anemone, right? It will clean off the dead tentacles or the tentacles that are no longer working very well for the anemone. And it also acts as kind of bait for fish to come and get it. So a fish might say, oh, there's a tasty looking snack, and the fish kind of goes after the anemone. And as soon as it gets close, the fish goes after the clownfish. And as soon as it gets close to the anemone stings it, and now the anemone has this really nice meal. So it's a very mutualistic, very interesting mutualism case that you see here. Okay, so let's talk. So now that we know our interspecific relationships, let's talk a little bit. Let's zoom out again and talk about our community and how we define a community. So a community can be defined by the species. Remember, it's the type of species that are there and the diversity of those species. So let's talk about a couple terms in terms of the species that live in a particular geographic region. The first one is, we're going to call it the dominant species, and the dominant species is the species that is more numerous than others. And it usually defines that particular ecological community. If you noticed, when we were looking at the biomes, in fact, I can, let's just go right now. I just want, no, I don't need to keep those. Let's discard those. So if you recall, when you were looking, I think I can pull this up. Yeah. So when you were looking at the different biomes, notice that, where was it? Like some of the biomes are actually defined by their dominant species. Like a temperate grassland, what do you think the dominant species is there? Well, it's grass, right? And then hopefully you know the difference between a deciduous tree and a coniferous tree. Deciduous trees, see, you guys don't know what real trees are out here. You're so spoiled out here. It's just crazy. All you see are palm trees and beautiful trees. But if you were to go in the Midwest or basically anywhere else other than Southern California, you would see that deciduous trees are trees that basically drop their leaves in winter, right? So the sun goes away and the tree basically goes into survival mode, and it doesn't need its solar panels anymore, so it gets rid of them. They drop their leaves. That's called a deciduous tree. So in a temperate deciduous forest, the dominant species are deciduous trees in general, and probably one type of deciduous tree in particular, depending on what particular region we're in. And then of course with temperate coniferous forests, it's going to be conifers, which are what we think of as like pine trees or cone trees. They have the needles. The Torrey pine, for example, is a perfect example of a coniferous tree. They don't drop their leaves. They're well adapted to going long periods of time without water and so on. So we can see that biomes tend to be remember, a biome, we're not even talking about biomes in the community structure. We're just talking about a region, right? So if we were to go to our area and zoom in on the chaparral, let's see if it'll, this wasn't very good about talking about plants. Yeah, so if we were to do, in fact, this is one of the, if we were in our face-to-face class, we would actually walk Florida Canyon and talk about chaparral species. And there's about 5 different types of shrubs. That another term for chaparral forest is an elfin forest, because you don't see trees. Like, think about all the trees that you see like at Balboa Park or in the neighborhoods, basically in San Diego, they're all transplants. None of them are native. I don't even know if there is an actual native. The Torrey pine. So the Torrey pine or the Monterey pine, some of those pine trees that are here are native species, but that's it, and they're not even that big. And this is because in a chaparral area, there really aren't what we would think of as trees. So the dominant species wouldn't be a tree in a chaparral; it would be some type of shrub. Probably the Toyon, maybe. I'd have to look up. I know there's a couple of there's a native broom species. Anyway, so depending on what region we're in of the chaparral itself, we could say, because in California there's different regions of chaparral, whether we're talking about here in Southern California or in the eastern part of the state where it's more mountainous and elevated and so on. So dominant species, right? And I'm trying to think of course, we're not talking about aquatic biomes. We're not talking about the ocean. So any terrestrial biome, the dominant species is going to be a plant. On the other hand, we have what's called a keystone species. This is definitely not the one that is the largest, like the most numerous. And it's usually a top predator. So it's actually it's a very small part of in terms of total number. So it gets its term for, if you've ever seen, how would I say this? How like stone bridges or archways were built. You would basically stack stones, right? You would kind of build stones and support them. And then you had this stone up at the top that held everything. So you had a structure underneath it that would support this. And when you put this stone in at the top, this stone being called the keystone, you could then take away that support structure underneath the arch or the bridge, and the bridge would actually hold. So it's kind of an architectural term, it's referring to that basically that stone that is holding all the other stones in place. And so a keystone species in a region is the animal that will have a dramatic effect on what that region kind of looks like. And it keeps everything else kind of in its place. A perfect example of this, and that's the example that I always gave when I lived in Wisconsin, is the wolf. In fact, if we were to go to the eastern part of our state, eastern part of Southern California, the Mexican gray wolf was another example of this. Unfortunately, they're functionally extinct now, right? The U.S. Forest Service, I think it was either the Forest Service or the Fish and Wildlife Service, killed them all in the 20th century. And essentially the same thing happened in Wisconsin. So the wolves were gone, and it dramatically changed the ecosystem in Wisconsin, the northern part of that state. The deer population, the caribou populations exploded. They overate and changed the understory of all of the forests. So when now, even just in the last 20 years, now that wolves are kind of making their way back into that upper Midwest portion of the United States, we're already seeing its impact on these forests, and they're becoming healthier. And this is because the wolves are considered a keystone species. And again, they're that top predator because they're going to affect every piece of that ecosystem that's below them. All right, so hopefully you know the answer to this because you've already done the lab for this one. So ask yourself if you know what the correct answer for this question is. So we're talking about otters, right? And if you recall, if you've done the lab already, I think this is lab 16, you know that otters are Not necessarily a top predator because, believe it or not, killer whales, orcas actually eat otters, which is really sad to me. Otters are just way too cute to eat. But otters eat, one of their favorite things to eat is sea urchin, and sea urchins are really good, right? And otters know this, and so they eat it. And so if otters are gone from a region, the sea urchins basically explode, and the population explodes, right? They get really, really numerous, and they get really big, and they eat the kelp, right? And so the kelp forests go away, and that dramatically changes the habitat because the kelp forest is basically like a nursery for fish. If you ever, again, if you fish off the coast at all, if you've ever gone fishing, every fisherman in Southern California knows exactly where those kelp forests are because that's where all the fish are. They use the kelp to hide in. They use the kelp to lay their eggs in. It's where the baby fish kind of grow up until they can get big enough to leave the kelp forest and so on. And so those kelp forests are absolutely vital to a functioning ecosystem in an aquatic habitat. And if we don't have those sea otters to keep the urchins in check, the kelp forests go away. So otters are a keystone species. Right? Without otters, it dramatically changes the landscape of that particular ecosystem, in this case, the kelp forest. Okay. When we're talking about a community, we also want to talk about diversity. So when we have more diversity, we're going to have open, so basically we're not going to have a niche that goes unfilled. In other words, we're going to have an animal or an organism that is colonizing every type of niche. So that means lots of resource partitioning. Remember, that means that all these animals are breaking up their roles in a community and playing their role, or utilizing their particular resource to the best of their ability. And we also see lots of mutualism. In a community that's not as diverse, we're going to see more interspecies competition, and we also tend to see more disturbances as well. They're more, I shouldn't say that, they're more susceptible to disturbances. It's a more fragile ecosystem. Let's just go back to our biome example. Do I still have it? Okay, good. And ask yourself, what do you think is the least diverse biome? So if we have all these different biomes, what is the least? So hopefully it becomes pretty obvious that it would be polar ice. Like, what can live up here? Nothing. And let's remind ourselves we're here. And look at our numbers here, right? We have about 80 species of animals, some amphibians, 50 different types of reptiles. Now let's compare that to polar ice. 0, 0, and oh, there's one mammal. What is it? What mammal is it? Now I have to know. Wildlife. 0, 0. Oh, the stoat. Well, that animal is as cute as it's. It wins the show. I now have to show you how cute a stoat is. Let me see if I can find it. There were stoats. They're also called winter weasels. And they're really, really cute. There's a really cute, let me see if I can find it. There's a really cute, what do you call those little short videos, GIFs of stoats? Oh yeah, here he is. Just look how cute he is. Those are stoats, and apparently they live in Greenland. Oh, this one's cute too. But there you go, the lone inhabitant of the polar ice region of Greenland, right? And so you want to talk about a fragile ecosystem, right? That's about as fragile as it gets. And we compared that to our region, of course, the chaparral, where we have, again, 150 plus different species of reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. Now let's go to the mother lode, right? The tropical rainforest, right? The Amazon. Look at that. 200, 300, 350 different species of animals. Almost over 200. I bet in other areas there's even more than that. Yeah, it's over 200 different species of mammals alone. And that's just the ones we know about. We only have, I think in this entire region, if you So you can see that Amazon River Basin right there, right? And all of those rivers that are coming off of it. We've only tracked, I want to say about 40% of this region, which is just incredible. So think about all the animals that we haven't even found yet. That's how dense and how diverse and how abundant that tropical rainforest ecosystem is. So more diversity versus less diversity. And you tend to see this, right? The trend here, of course, if we zoom out again, I hate it when the planet's off balance. There we go. Is that better? Wait, where's the, oh, let's show the grid lines. Can I do that? No, not that one. That's not what I wanted. I know there's an option. Let me go back to the globe. There's a way you can, oh, there it is, grid lines. I don't know why it really bugs me when I look at the globe and I can't. There we go. Oh, okay, I was pretty close. There we go. So there's the equator. So generally speaking, the closer we get to the equator, and you can see, like, look at where all these tropical ecosystems are, right? Equator. I think that's one of the questions on your lab 15. If we look at where all these tropical ecosystems are, they're basically between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Oh my goodness. The Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. Whereas the further you get, so again, here's the equator, the further you get away, the less species diversity you have, because the less solar access you have, and therefore the less dominant species you have, right? Like, think about what plants grow in the tundra and the alpine, just that like kind of lichen that can grow in the permafrost, right? And that's not going to feed anybody. So the further we get away from the equator, the less and less diverse we have in terms of our species, in terms of abundance and diversity. And therefore, we're going to have a lot more interspecies competition because they're competing for fewer resources, and they're going to be much more susceptible to disturbances. This is why one of the, you think about the tragedy of what's happening with the melting ice up in the North Sea and the Arctic Circle. Oh, for goodness sake, the polar bear. The polar bear doesn't have that many options. If it can't eat seal, it's not like it can just go eat fox or go eat, something else. There's really not that many food options for those polar bears. So if the seal population collapses, that means that the polar bear population is going to collapse as well. Okay. So again, let's go back to this term trophic structure, and really this is about relationships and what, and a particular kind of relationship, an unpleasant one, and that's of course what eats what. And we have these 5 different kind of levels in terms of trophic structure. And again, and this is why the dominant species is considered dominant, because it forms the basis for this entire food chain. Our dominant species are really going to be our producers. They're the plants. And not just plants, I should say, they're the photosynthetic organisms. So in an aquatic environment, those are the phytoplankton and the photosynthetic capable microbes that are floating in the ocean that form the basis. Again, this is what feeds the barnacles, for example. On land in a terrestrial environment, it's those plants. It's all the photosynthetic plants that are kind of forming the bottom of that food chain. So primary consumers are going to be the organisms that feed on plants. Secondary consumers can feed on both primary consumers and producers. Tertiary consumers can feed on both secondary and primary consumers. And quaternary consumers can feed on all of them. So we kind of have this trophic structure in terms of what can eat what. We know that this really isn't a food chain, right? We know that it's not a linear relationship in any ecosystem. It's really more like a web. And we can see that, right? We can see our producers here, and a variety of those primary consumers can eat a variety of different primary producers. And whereas they can in turn become prey for a variety of predators. And so because we have all of these different relationships between animals based on what they're eating and what's eating them, we can create what's called a food web. Is there detritivores in this guy? There is not. Okay, it's in the next one. All right. Read this description of a hypothetical island and ask yourself, which is the incorrect relationship here? So this is a bit tricky, one, because I haven't actually defined what a detrivore is. And a detrivore, that's why I was asking if there was a, yeah, there's not. Let me go forward. Wait with me for just a second. Okay, there's not. So a crucial part of this food web that's not actually being shown is, actually Mufasa knows the answer to this question. Mufasa, a very wise leader, right? This is the circle of life. Remember when he was talking to Simba and he was talking about how they eat the deer, but someday they'll die and they'll become the grass and the deer eats the grass and so on, right? This is the circle of life. And this is what this particular diagram here, this food web, is missing. So let's take this owl. Poor owl runs into a window and dies. How does that owl become back into the food? Like, how does his matter, like all of the actual nutrients that are in his body, how do they become recycled for other things to eat? Well, it gets broken down, right? It gets broken down by by bacteria, by fungi, by millipedes and centipedes and little insects and so on, right? It's worms, for example. Sounds super gross, right? And we all think about like a rotting body or an animal carcass, and they're just super gross. But it turns out that this is an absolutely essential part of any kind of food web, because these animals, or I shouldn't say these organisms, they're not really animals, but these organisms are called detrivores. And detritus, it comes from the word detritus, and sorry, that's an R. Detritus, yeah. Detritus, detrivores are organisms that eat dead things. So some of you have maybe heard of those, what are they called? They're very weird and fancy pedicures where you can put your feet in water and the fish eat your feet, eat the skin off your feet, right? So they're only eating the dead bits, right? They're only eating the skin that has built up over time and is long since dead. And it's not going to eat any, those fish don't nibble off anything that's alive, right? They're detrivores. Another example that's actually really pretty gross, but effective, is that you can actually put some hospitals. This is so gross. I don't think any hospitals in the United States does this, but some hospitals will actually put maggots on a wound, because maggots only eat dead tissue. So if you have a really bad wound and it's become necrotic, in other words, there's dead tissue on this wound, you can actually put maggots on that wound, and the maggots will eat the dead tissue but not eat the living tissue. And so then once they've eaten everything they can, you take the maggots off. It's so gross. You take the maggots off, and they literally clean your wound for you, which is kind of a weird way of thinking about it. So these detrivores, they play a really gross kind of thing you don't really want to think about, but they play an absolutely vital role because they recycle these nutrients from all the things that once were alive and are now dead. So now that we know that the moths here are eating the cast-off feathers. So moths are detrivores. This is correct. So this is not one of our options. The fungi are also, I think, inhabiting the poop, right? Let me see here. Fungi and other microorganisms that live on the bird poop. So they are also detrivores, right? They're eating things that are no longer alive. So they're also detrivores. They're recycling those nutrients. The tick, of course, is a parasite, because it is getting a benefit from the birds, but it's not helping the birds in any way. It could be even maybe making the bird slightly anemic or somehow using energy from the bird. So it's a bad thing for the bird, but a good thing for the tick. That's a parasitic relationship. So the only one left, just by process of elimination, we know is A. And the booby and the noddy, yes, those are actual names for birds. These birds are not primary producers. Remember, primary producers are photosynthetic on land anyway. Primary producers are photosynthetic plants. Okay, so this takes us to the last kind of theme of this particular lecture, and that is this theme of energy flow and matter cycles. And remember, the nutrients are a type of matter. So when we talk about nutrients, we're talking about carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, and so on, right? All of those nutrients that any organism needs to actually make those macromolecules. Remember, we have those 4 major macromolecules that we need to make our bodies: lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins. And ultimately, these, along with hydrogen and oxygen, make up about 96%, let's just say over 95% of our body. Carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur. Yeah, that's all of them. Great. So these nutrients cycle. Remember that we can't create or destroy energy. And so I don't know if you've ever seen like they're called terrariums, where you can basically put a certain group of animal or organisms, I should say, in a sealed box, and it can actually live that way for a really long time, as long as you don't put it in like too hot of a window or something. If you set it up correctly, all of the nutrients can cycle in that little ecosystem that you just created. So let's remind ourselves. I think I started to mention the first law of what was it? The first law? No. Law of conservation of mass, right? Remember, we can't create or destroy matter. It can only be changed from one form to the next. Remember that energy also has a couple laws that govern how energy flows. And the first law, of course, is that we can't create or destroy energy either. We can only flow from one form to the next. In other words, that's kind of what the second law is saying, is that we can change the quality, we can change the form of energy. So energy can go from the radiant energy that the sun puts out to stored energy in a chemical bond, for example. And remember that every time we kind of change that the form that energy takes, it's going to make the universe a bit more disordered. In other words, we're going to create a lot of energy is lost as heat. And remember that heat is even though we like it, right? It makes us kind of feel good to be out in the sun or a warm fire or something. Heat is a very disordered, low quality form of energy. So when we think of our planet, again, kind of in your mind, think of our planet like a big ship or a big rock. I guess it is a big rock, but like we're a big spaceship, and we're hurtling through space, right? And everything that we have is on our ship. We don't get anything. We don't get any inputs. I mean, every once in a while we'll get like a meteor or something that actually, did you know that I'm getting my lectures confused. I might have mentioned this already, but I think it's so cool. But because meteors are actually, it's a really cool industry to get into, because meteors contain really valuable rare earth elements. And so if you're a meteor hunter, you can try to find these crashed meteors and meteorites, and you sell them for a ton of money. So other than meteors, we don't get any inputs, right? We don't have any matter coming in. We don't have like a shipment of carbon coming to us from Mars or something. Anything that we have is already here. So we're really recycling everything. However, we have a constant supply of energy, and of course that energy comes from our sun. How do we harness that energy, right? How do we actually make that energy do something useful? Well, we're really lucky to have these organisms called plants and other photosynthetic organisms like bacteria and algae and so on. And these plants are going to convert the energy from the sun, that light energy, into stored chemical energy. So then a consumer, for example, a caterpillar, is going to take the energy that's stored in that plant, that photosynthetic organism, and it's going to use that energy to grow and to add mass to its body and eventually become a butterfly. But the thing to understand here is that energy conversion is not efficient at all. So let's take an example. Like everyone, you know what a solar panel is, a solar module. You see them on the roofs of people's homes. Solar panels, even the best solar panels, like a really expensive, high quality, kind of newer model solar panel, is probably, maybe if it's lucky, 20% efficient. That means that of all the radiant energy, all the light energy that's hitting that solar module from the sun, only about a fifth of it is actually being converted to electricity. They're not very efficient at all. Animals, us, depending on the animal, we're even worse. I think only about 10-15% of the energy that we consume. So think about the energy that we eat in a day, how many calories you're going to take in. Only about 15% of that energy, 10-15% of that energy, is actually going to be used to make you grow. And then, of course, depending on how much you eat, that growth can be a lot or a little. And this is why growing teenagers, growing kids need so much food, because they are only about 10% of that food is being used to make them grow, and they're growing a lot during that time. So where's the rest of that energy going? Well, remember, a lot of it's being lost as heat. So a lot of it we can't use, right? So a lot of it is just going to pass right through us as feces. And then another part of it is being burned just simply by walking around, moving around, using all of keeping our homeostasis in check and so on. So when we think about the energy that we're consuming, we're losing most of it, right? Any organism that eats is losing most of it. So what this says is that basically every time we eat something, right? If we're growing something, if we have a garden, and we think about all the energy that's contained in all of those plants, and we eat all of it. Let's say we can eat all of the plant. Only about 10% of that is being passed on to us, because most of that energy, again, is just being lost by doing the life processes. Remember, that plant grew from a seed into a little seedling, and it kept growing and so on. And so only a very small portion of that energy that's stored is something that we can actually use. So if we're a grasshopper, right, we're going to take that 10% of all the energy that those producers made, and we're going to eat it. And that grasshopper is going to burn most of that energy hopping around. Think about have you ever seen grasshoppers have like crazy hops? Like, it's really wild to watch a grasshopper. Like, it'll just be sitting there, and then all of a sudden it'll just like launch itself like 4 feet in the air. It's really wild how good of jumpers they are, but that takes a lot of energy, I guess, is my point. And so a lot of the energy that is taken in by grasshoppers is used up by hopping around and moving around and avoiding predation by the mouse that this guy apparently wasn't able to do. And so most of that energy is lost. Only about 10% of that energy is carried on to those secondary consumers. And then, of course, this mouse is wasting a lot of energy chasing after the grasshopper, living its best life, and so on. And so when that snake eats the mouse, he in turn only gets 10% of that energy. So basically, at every level of that trophic cascade or that trophic structure, we're only harvesting about 10% of the available energy that I shouldn't say available, the energy that the previous trophic level had taken in. In other words, it takes 10,000 calories to support only 10 calories for a snake. So what is that? That's 10%, 1%, 0.1%, right? So only about 0.1% of the primary amount of energy that the primary producers produce will ultimately get harvested by those tertiary consumers. And this is why those tertiary consumers need, like, think about in your mind what a tertiary consumer is. Orcas, right? Those big whales, wolves, bears, mountain lions. Why do they need so much space, right? Why does one mountain lion take up like half of LA? Because they need a ton of, like, they need all of this space, right? Like that one mountain lion, right, needs all of the space to produce that support the grasshoppers, that support the mice, that feed the rattlesnakes, that feed the mountain lion. And I don't know if mountain lions eat rattlesnakes, probably not, but you get the idea, right? We have that. So that's why those tertiary consumers play such a vital role, and they're really the most fragile. They're usually the ones that are gone from an ecosystem first as soon as that ecosystem gets disturbed in any way. That's a perfect example of that are polar bears, right? As soon as that their few food sources start to run out, the seals, I guess it would be, they don't have anywhere else to go, and they need a lot of them in order to survive. So this is also a good example of why vegetarianism is such a, or I shouldn't even say vegetarian, but just choosing to eat vegetables more, right? So there's a kind of interesting concept among ecologically minded people where you just try to limit the amount of meat that you eat. So take 1 or 2 days out of the week, or try to make like breakfast and lunch vegetarian only, and only eat meat once a day or 3 times a week or something like this. Because if you think about what we're doing, if we're behaving as vegetarians, we're basically at the primary consumer level of of consuming. So we're basically feeding on producers. But if we're eating meat, if we're meat eaters, then we're actually acting as secondary consumers. And so we're wasting an entire trophic level worth of energy and therefore space and resources and water and so on. So it greatly diminishes the environmental impact by basically directly eating those vegetables instead of eating the things that are eating the vegetables. So again, I mentioned earlier the nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, hydrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and so on. Remember that our planet is recycling, right? The amount of carbon that's on this planet is staying constant. And they move through those producers to consumers. And then both of these producers and consumers, as soon as they pass away, they're going to get recycled by detrivores. And then when those detrivores they can either pass away and become part of the abiotic reservoir. So that abiotic reservoir would be like, I'm sure you've heard that, like hydrocarbons. Another term for hydrocarbons are fossil fuels. So the oil reserves and the natural gas deposits that we're harvesting for energy right now, another term for them are fossil fuels. And this is because they are literally made from fossils. They are from long dead plants and animals that died millions and millions of years ago and decomposed over time to just basically become very pure forms of carbon. And so those reservoirs of carbon and hydrogen, for example, are going to get recycled in some way and turned back into nutrients that are available to producers. So for example, we can burn gasoline. The gasoline becomes carbon dioxide in the air. The carbon dioxide in the air gets taken up by a plant in photosynthesis. The plant gets eaten by a mouse or a caterpillar or a grasshopper, whatever it might be. And so we have this idea of cycling again and again and again. So, of course, one good example, and this is kind of what I was talking about in the previous slide, the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle, where to even begin? Okay, so let's say that we're a molecule of carbon dioxide in the air. We can get taken in through the stomata, or not stomata, stoma. I always get those words confused. Stoma of a leaf in photosynthesis. So that tree can then get eaten directly, right? Like the leaf on a tree can get eaten directly by a primary consumer. Alternately, that leaf could fall, like in the fall, if it's a deciduous tree, it could fall to the ground through what is that called when the leaves fall in the autumn? Becomes litter and basically becomes part of the soil, and then eventually becomes basically an abiotic reservoir of carbon. Alternately, that carbon could go into the rabbit, right? The rabbit gets eaten by the a lynx or something, right? And then whether this happens in the rabbit or in the lynx, it can get breathed out through respiration, and then it goes back into the air. So we have this cycle of carbon dioxide, right? And of course, the carbon over long periods of time, it can become coal, it can become oil, natural gas, some type of fossil fuel. It can get burned, and then it goes back in the atmosphere as well. So this is the carbon cycle. Carbon never goes away. The problem, of course, now is that we have too much carbon up here and not enough down here, right? So for most of history, most of the ecological history of the Earth, carbon was sequestered in the lithosphere. In other words, down here in the crust of the Earth. And we've been taking it out through natural gas, coal, fossil fuel extraction, and we've been burning it for energy and for electricity. And that's putting a lot of that carbon dioxide in the air where it really doesn't belong. Okay, I think this is the last slide. So here's a kind of concept question for you. Don't actually write it down. Just see if you can understand the question. Okay, so we're here. Right? We're a minke whale and we have lots of blubber. We have lots of fat. And of course, fat has a lot of carbon atoms in it. So we're a carbon atom in a fat molecule in a minke whale. So how could we get to be part of a crab eater seal? That's the question. Well, let's see where that carbon atom can move. So the minke whale could die. It could go into a decomposer, like crabs and lobsters are really good decomposers. They're bottom feeders. This is, I don't know, it's really interesting to me. I don't know if you realize this, but crabs and lobster were actually used to be considered a poor man's food because they were bottom feeders. They were very cheap to find and harvest, and now as they become harder to find for whatever reason, they are now more expensive. I hate the taste of lobster. I don't like shellfish very much, but that's probably because I grew up in the Midwest and I always had like really bad shellfish. But anyway, off topic. Minke whale, they can die. They can be decomposed, right? By crabs, by lobsters, by bacteria, and so on. And then that bacteria can be eaten by phytoplankton, for example, or be released into the atmosphere, and the phytoplankton can get it in carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. The krill could eat the phytoplankton, and the crab eater seal can eat the krill. Right, so we need to basically connect those arrows, right? Alternately, right, the minke whale can get eaten by a killer whale. The killer whale could die, and the cycle basically goes in the same way. So we basically have to go in a circle. Notice that we can't go laterally, right? The crab eater seal can't eat the minke whale. I think that does it. This is probably the longest lecture. I was thinking about doing it in 2, but just over an hour, so not too bad. Only one.